Erin Sprague, welcome to Second Nature. Thanks so much for joining us.
I just can't believe I got you two off of a trail and into a studio. So, welcome to you as well.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, it's not every day that we have the CEO of a high powered institution, that being Protect Our Winters, here on the podcast. We appreciate your presence. Before we went live here, we were just talking about our connective tissue, that being Matt Sharkey. Friend of Matt Sharkey is a friend of ours. As I said, he's a multiple time guest here on the podcast. And there's so much to talk about here. I wanted to maybe start with a broad question, looking at your work history. We'll go into some of the details here, but it feels to me like you have a lot of experience working in both like the for-profit space for large institutions in some cases, and then also now taking over what is more of a nonprofit institution that's built more around advocacy and activism. And so maybe we could start by just comparing and contrasting working on both sides of that coin.
Yeah, well, one of the things I love about the outdoor industry is it's rooted in passion. So, you have all of these brands that have what I call a power crystal in them. And when I've made decisions about who to work with and what brands to help build, I've always sought this magic in the brand. And that's true of Specialized and their product innovation, where I spend some time. It's true of Aspen as a destination. And it's true of POW. POW, like no pun intended, has the power crystal and the ability to build something really big. And I found for profit, nonprofit, like that's a tax structure. Our products are a little bit different, but at the end of the day, it's about the culture and about the drive. And within POW, I often feel like we're more of a small outdoor brand that's hustling to make it and to put climate on the radar of outdoor enthusiasts than anything else.
This is one of the most requested discussions that we've had through the history of Second Nature. I swear our Instagram DMs are like, you got to talk to somebody from Protect Our Winters. But for the people who aren't, as aware of what you do and what the organization kind of stands for, could you just give a quick primer to the audience of what Protect Our Winters is all about?
Yeah, POW is the outdoor movement for climate action. So we started in 2007. Jeremy Jones, I'm sure your audience knows who he is, but for the non snowboarders, he's widely considered to be one of the best big mountain snowboarders in the world. And he looked around the 60-degree slopes that he was on and said, hey, the snow is changing. And think back to 2007. This was a totally different era in climate. An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's like monumental piece of work, came out in 2006. And Jeremy at the time was like, I don't know what I can do, but I have to do something. And I love that mentality. And he sort of looked at like, well, what do I do well? And he asked a lot of his other friends, fellow pro athletes, and they realized that they had a voice and a powerful voice. And so they built Protect Our Winters. So we're a group of snowboarders, skiers, runners, cyclists, rock climbers, really any outdoor enthusiast. And we're uniting that passion into real climate action. So when you think about movement building and groups, an example we use a lot is the NRA, the National Rifle Association. So love them or hate them, they have built a really successful movement, but there are actually fewer people who own guns in the US. It's about 40% than people who love the outdoors, which is almost 60%, and probably like 100% in the audience listening to this podcast. So that is the making of a group of people that could be really influential and powerful. We are a $1 trillion industry. And so the goal of POW is to unite any outdoor enthusiast, all 175 million of them. We call that the outdoor state, and drive systemic climate solutions, which usually happen at a policy level.
Build on that statement of the outdoor state, because to me, when I first learned about it a few years ago, it seemed like a brilliant branding device to help your prospective audience and people who do share similar values to rally around a cause. And it helps you frame things a little bit differently. So, yeah, go deeper on the outdoor state philosophy.
It initially came from a research insight. So we spend a lot of time in the data. We have a group of people we call our Science Alliance. They're a group of people who, in the past 3 years, have published 500 different pieces of scholarship on climate. And like, how many people have read that, right? So, one of the really important parts of POW is to take that research data and information and distill it into something that's more accessible. Climate can be super wonky, super intimidating. I remember when I started, I was like, I feel like I'm studying for a high school like science final exam every day. And we thought, well, okay, like we know that there are all these people. What's a way that others might relate to that and understand it? And we had the insight of, if you combined every single outdoor enthusiast, we would be one of, if not the largest interest groups. We would be bigger than any state in the union, which have so much power as we're in an election season. And we thought, well, this is the outdoor state. Like, we're going to help everyone understand what's going on, and we're going to unite everyone and bring them together. And it's our top selling t-shirt. So I think it's a concept that's like fully resonated with our audience.
Yeah, because outdoor people reside across the country, but it just so happens that many of the swing states are like Arizona and Nevada and North Carolina, where, they could probably swing things in one direction or another just based on political engagement. And so maybe this is a way to help outdoor oriented people to understand that they're part of a greater collective that does have political power.
Exactly. And we tend to work in battleground states. That's one of our criteria, states where we have big outdoor communities and states with big outdoor recreation economies. And Montana, New Mexico, Arizona, we're recording this right before the election. And those are massively influential states in how the congressional roadmap is going to shake out.
How do you balance all this stuff between, I mean, the alliances that you have, like taking in all of the information, doing grants for the science that needs to be done, working with the athletes that you have, but then also the legislative? It seems like you're doing, you're all out on all fronts here. How do you manage this whole thing?
Yeah, our team, I mean, there are a bunch of athletes, so they are total go-getters. They like to win. And this is where, the sort of like myth of like nonprofits are easy and less hard, that is like so the opposite at POW. Like, the output we have, we're comparing ourselves against the best brands in the world in terms of the messaging, and we have half the team and half the assets. So we have to get scrappier. We have to be really thoughtful and smart about what we bring to market. We say no to a lot of things. And we know that there is this really important role for athletes and creatives and scientists to play. So we really root in the power of our alliances. So the athletes are most well known. We have Olympians, we have World Cup winners, world record holders, fastest known time setters. I mean, Dylan, you're a member of the POW Run Alliance, so you can probably speak to this too. But they're the ones that open doors and open up an unexpected pathway to influence. And then the science and creative are supporting functions. And then the other piece that's really important that a lot of people underestimate are the brands that are a part of POW. So Burton, 11th Hour Racing, REI, Patagonia, Yeti. I mean, name your outdoor brand. We work with most of them as their partners in advocacy. And brands have these massive levers for influence that I think is sometimes underestimated, whether they're putting out a point of view, giving employees a day off just to go vote, or actually participating in campaigns that we have, like our Stoke the Vote campaign, and putting on their channels that this work is important.
So at the end of the day, PAL really is a communications. I mean, that's probably the biggest challenge of the enterprise, right? And maybe that originated from Jeremy, but it has been very effective in engaging influential individuals who do have an audience, both on the individual level with athletes, as you mentioned, also with the brands. Am I touching on something there? Is there a underlying priority to communications as being like the key driver of impact?
I would say it's both. So I'm a long-term brand person, and the secret to brand is actually product. If you have an exceptional product that you're putting out into the world, it's actually a lot easier to build a brand. You don't want to be in the other direction, right? Where you're trying to promote something that, maybe isn't as strong as you want it to be. So when we think upstream, the core product absolutely has to be advocacy. So we go to DC and we fight for legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act. Speaking of brand, worst branded piece of legislation ever, but literally the biggest and most important piece of climate legislation that has ever passed, almost $400 billion. And we were a part of a coalition of organizations that helped pass it. And these things don't just happen in DC. It's like anything. You have to go and you have to make your voice heard. And a lot of people, me included in a former life, thought of lobbying and advocacy as like, I don't know how that feels. But guess what? Fossil fuel interests have a really big lobby. Big corporations have really, really big lobbies. And it actually doesn't take that much to put an issue on the desk of a Congress man or woman. And so when we go with the power of these influential athletes, like American heroes, who we train to be able to speak in a substantive way about what they're seeing in their lives as athletes on trails and on snow, and also the science and the legislation of what we need to move forward. So doing that is absolutely step one. And we've lobbied for everything from the Inflation Reduction Act to now we're lobbying for grid transmission modernization. Super sexy topic. And then what I find is that a lot of organizations stop there, and we don't. The comms are just as important. So we often joke that climate change needs a publicist, and I don't know, maybe that's POW. But we think that the storytelling and the movement building and how you help people understand that this is a systemic issue that we can influence, that's a big part of what we do, because ultimately the power is in uniting outdoor enthusiasts into a movement.
What's been the most surprising thing about transitioning into this role where you do have a lot of interaction with political entities? Has that been frustrating, educational, enlivening?
All of the above. It has been more similar to the past than I thought. Like building a business is hard, advocating for change is hard. I think part of what I've had to adjust to is the timeline. So, the timeline of how you drive change in climate is massive. So, think about it, like we have to change every single part of how we function as humans, how we get around, how we eat, how we turn on lights in our homes, how we heat and cool buildings. I mean, everything is related to energy consumption. And that's the great irony of climate change. It's this super solvable problem. All the science and technology exists today to solve it. It's my greatest source of hope. But the challenge is we have to shift political and cultural will. And that's where the storytelling and the human and emotional connection that POW spends a lot of time on is really important. Most people care, but you have to make them really care and really feel it and really feel an emotional connection. And that's where outdoor passion is so important. That's a part of people's families and people's like greatest hobbies, greatest triumphs, greatest losses at some finish lines, right? And so we really tap into that. And what I navigate is the highs and lows of how long it takes to make that shift. And so I'm learning how to navigate that in the face of urgency to solve the problem.
Everything takes much longer and is much more expensive than you expect. Just staying on this topic of storytelling and communications, I feel like also we are dealing with somewhat complicated subject matter. You said it's fairly simple. It's about how much energy we're consuming. But at the end of the day, there are vast and oftentimes complex consequences to climate change that an average person like myself might have a difficult time understanding and then translate into political action. On the other side of the coin, it can also be overwhelmingly nerve wracking, scary, terrifying about what the future might look like in a way that might, you know, encourage somebody to disengage from the subject matter altogether. How do you help people understand the current state of climate science? Because I know that's core to Protect Our Winters also, in a way that doesn't create that overwhelm and fear, but instead motivates action.
I always think when you're facing something really hard and complicated, there are two steps. And I don't know, maybe you experience this in your ultra run, right? So, first, break it down, like run the mile you're in, right? And we will often break down a really big topic into small, digestible parts. So, we give grants to athletes to create films and talk about their experiences, and they'll tackle something with the food system or imperfect advocacy, or in Jeremy's case, he just did a film about climate change in New Hampshire and reaching across the aisle. So breaking it down is one of the most important pieces. And then the second most important piece, this is a groundbreaking insight, so get ready, boys, is to tell the truth.
What?
I have been just
Unbelievable.
amazed by how, when you're like, yeah, this is really effing hard and we're going to go for it, but we're not sure if we're going to make it. All of a sudden, people are like, how can I help? And we talk about big aha moments that people might not know because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So, for example, the carbon footprint was created by an oil company ad campaign. So, here's an example of where people did not experience the truth. The truth is that an oil company is incentivized for people to feel an individual burden and responsibility for climate.
Mm.
That's not the truth of systemic change. The truth is we have to build a new energy system and we have to transition to cleaner sources of energy. And to do that, we need levers that are humongous, like policy, capital, technology. And so we're these like little underdogs out there being like, we know the truth. We're here to spread the word. And we find that that resonates, and it's an amazing source of power. You know, sometimes we say at POW, our shadow is longer than our tree. And it's because we're delivering that message and people get it because it's the truth of not only what's happened, but also how we have to make this transition.
That just blew my mind, actually.
Erin, have you ever tried that? Have you ever tried telling the truth, buddy?
No, first time.
Yeah,
right
I'm
there.
gonna look into that.
That is incredible, though. I think one of the other things that's very true, right? They're from the brand side, from the business side, they are being affected and will be affected in the future by not engaging in this. How do you tell that story and how do you connect with places? I mean, you think about resorts, you think about brands in the snow space that, if climate change shortens the window for people to snowboard and ski every year, that is going to make an impact on actual businesses. How do you have that conversation with brands, and how do you navigate that with these different scenarios?
I am so passionate about this question and so passionate about the role that corporations have to play. So, first, let's take the outdoor industry. We talked about trillion-dollar industry. There are multiple really effective conservation organizations, climate organizations that support and build this industry. And it's not like a nice to have. Like in some cases, it's a little bit easier in outdoor because it's business continuity. So Dylan and I both worked for Aspen Ski and Company, a absolute leader for decades, way ahead of their time in sustainability work. And the tension in that is apparent. It might be the private jet capital of the world, and yet they are so so progressive in advocacy and some of the on the ground work they've done in decarbonization. And it was really where I learned this subject and decided that I wanted to do this full time. And their business in the past 40 years has lost almost a month of their season. The ski business makes all of its money in 6 months and arguably a few windows within that 6 months. So when you look at that type of equation, I've also worked at Specialized in cycling. When you look at what's happening to recreation land from wildfires, it's not getting replaced. We are losing the trails and places that we recreate. I've worked in running. When I was at Virgin, we were building a running business. We had a race canceled in San Francisco because of a nearby wildfire. And so these business disruptions are actually an economic imperative for this industry. And what's happening to sustainability teams at companies is they are in this impossible position. Like, my greatest love is for corporate sustainability teams. These are the most passionate, driven people you will find. They are trying to drive change in a system that's built on driving profits. So in the outdoor industry, a little more straightforward. We can make the case, especially in ski and snow. In other businesses, these teams are getting fired. Their funding is getting cut. They're being held to these absolutely ridiculous reporting structures that don't even work. They all know it, but businesses are seeking metrics to demonstrate that this work is worthwhile. And that's why we think advocacy and policy level change is so important. We have to create a floor that everybody is beholden to through a law versus expecting a system that's rooted in capitalism to drive this externality. Climate is not the type of problem that any one business can solve, but businesses can come together to drive a collective solution. So it is a very, very complicated space. And the leaders that we talk to more and more are saying, hey, we're getting it now. Advocacy is the way. And my prediction is the next great wave of corporate sustainability is going to be the companies that embrace and lead through government level advocacy.
Fascinating. So maybe we could use Aspen Skiing Company as a bit of a case study as, an organization that does things well. I was telling you before we pressed record that, of course, yeah, I worked at Aspen Skiing Co. also. And in my day, Auden Schendler was in charge there of the sustainability initiatives. I'm not sure if he's still around, but I know he was very well respected in the space. You were the chief brand officer, so a very different function within the organization. So maybe two questions. What does Aspen Skiing Company do well that other organizations could mimic? And what did you learn there that set you on the path you're on now?
Yeah, so the first thing Aspen does well is they understand the power of the collective and they prioritize climate and decarbonization. This is a controversial point of view within sustainability. There are many issues that are important, but climate and specifically carbon pollution is the most urgent. And so that's what we urge companies to focus on. And that's something that Aspen always did. And they used their influence. This is a town of 7,000 full time residents that the entire world pays attention to. And they recognize that competitive advantage in this fight. So different companies are going to have different points of view on that. There are going to be companies that are much larger and have more scale. The biggest companies in the outdoor industry have massive scale that Aspen, didn't actually have. But Aspen had influence. And so we were writing op-eds all the time with our point of view. We were partnering with other organizations like Altera in the industry, some of the brand partners that were partners of the resort, and using that collective to have a voice. We would go to DC. I remember my first trip to DC was with POW. And I was like, does this work? I mean, we're showing up like we are, like, no offense, a bunch of dirtbags in suits, like, who are really good at sports, but are we going to make a difference in DC? So I went in kind of skeptical, actually. And after 15 straight meetings, my learning was that one, we had more influence than I thought. It was actually really interesting. A lot of staff members first just really wanted to talk to us. They were like, this is interesting and different. I just spent the past few days meeting with all sorts of horrible humans from evil businesses and spaces. And now look at this group of do gooders that's come in. So that opened the door. But then the door stayed open and we continue to have a seat at the table because we do a lot of technical work to make sure that we're contributing value. So we're supporting legislation. We're helping to draft future legislation to move the needle on clean energy. And so feeling that and seeing that, I was like, okay, this is a theory of change that really works. And Aspen in particular, and they're not the only ones, Burton is another great example. Patagonia is probably the greatest example of how to bring in corporate activism into a brand point of view. When it's authentic, it's differentiating. So again, you have to do that work first. You have to hit the pavement, go to DC, work with legislators, work with nonprofit organizations. Once you do, as a chief brand officer, I looked at it and said, okay, we've done the work. Now it's time to tell the world the story of this and to hopefully inspire other organizations to do the same. And I would like ride chairlifts and I would have customers like sitting there being like, oh yeah, we love what Aspen does in sustainability. That's one of the reasons we come here. So it makes a difference in your marketing, but it needs to be rooted in that real work. And that's where I see companies make mistakes. They haven't done the deep work and the hard and long-term work to make the story both authentic and successful.
Back to the storytelling and communications, huh, Erin?
Yeah.
Well, okay, maybe one more thing on this subject with brands and stuff, because we usually talk about commercial stuff on the podcast, what brands are doing, what are the new products, what's happening in the media ecosystem within various outdoor sports, providing our perspective on it. You mentioned Patagonia being the real leader from a brand perspective in the arena of sustainability. Maybe putting you on the spot here a little bit, you could explain to our audience what makes them leaders, maybe specifically the details about what happened. I think it was last year when Yvon Chouinard, who I think was still the 100% owner of Patagonia, placed it into a trust. To me, that's kind of esoteric and I don't fully understand, but obviously made a lot of news in the outdoor industry. Maybe you could clarify that a little bit and what makes Patagonia so effective.
Oh, I am so happy to talk about their GOAT status. So I think it goes back to another thing that we've talked about, which is they told the truth. If you go back to their groundbreaking "Don't Buy This Jacket" ad, which for every marketer listening, and like I have a copy of, it was such a brilliant tactic. But if you look at why it was successful, they really believe that. They believe that they're a business, but that consumerism is attention and a challenge, and it's something they navigate. And when I look at brands that are the strongest brands in the world that have some of that power crystal, they have that tension. Aspen had it in their sustainability work. Patagonia has it. They are a for-profit business and proud of that. And that's how they fund all of their work. POW has it. Our founder, Jeremy Jones, talks about his legacy of accessing remote mountain ranges by helicopter and the transport systems that he had to use in the past to be able to access that terrain. Now he climbs everywhere and is like the world's fittest man. So he's on a different level. But there is absolutely that tension that comes to life. And what I think Patagonia continues to do well is they continue to look for how can they balance those two things, running a business with products that we all love and purchase and use in our outdoor experiences, while being one of the best organizations in the world at dedicating some of those profits to frontline advocacy efforts in rivers, in climate, in recreation, in outdoor communities. So I think it's that blend and that balance and how they shed truth and authenticity on some of those unexpected lines.
But what about that corporate structure piece? I'm just personally curious about it. Like, it was basically like Yvon Chouinard left the company to planet Earth, more or less, and that
Yeah.
there was some, I don't know, organizational body that was impartial, that was going to be controlling the assets that the company created in perpetuity. Is that accurate?
More or less, they can probably explain better. They structured a nonprofit organization in a structure that also has the ability to give grants to advocacy organizations who are a recipient. And it also has the ability to make political endorsements. That's actually fairly unusual. They are taking a point of view that it is important for a corporation to be involved in the political game. And we do the same thing. We have POW, which is a 501c3. That's a nonprofit. In the POW universe, we actually can't endorse candidates. We can drive voter turnout, but we can't like allocate those funds to election work. We have another type of organization, which is called a 501c4, if you're up on your IRS tax code. And that organization is also a nonprofit, but it can endorse candidates. And that's the organization that participates with Patagonia and with other, and believe me, there are very few corporate entities that want to get involved in electing pro climate candidates. So, what we do in that organization is we look across the board and say, okay, where are there outdoor recreation economies with pro climate candidates who are going to really benefit from the outdoor community that POW can activate? So, for example, in the upcoming 2024 fall election, the Montana Senate seat is one of the most hotly contested seats in the country. The balance of power in the Senate and whether or not we have a pro environmental agenda is going to come down to a couple states, and Montana is one of them. The dynamics in Montana, if you've talked to anyone from the community, there are new types of wealth moving in. Cities like Bozeman are going through massive growth. There is a mix of liberals, conservatives, libertarians, all sorts of perspectives. This election will be won or lost by a few thousand votes. And so POW goes in and we activate the outdoor state in that community. We were at the Run the Rut 50K. We go door to door. I knocked on doors for John Tester wearing my POW AF hat, which is our action fund. And that type of work that is ground game, hardcore, like get someone elected work, that is some of the most important work in climate, but it's still at the vanguard. There are a lot of companies and individuals who are still a little bit tentative in how they want to participate in the political process.
Shout out to the Rut 50K. Mike Foote, I know, is involved with Protect Our Winters also. To what degree, I'm not sure, but I know it's something he's been really passionate about. It makes me wonder also, as you talk about the Montana seat in the upcoming election, to what extent this topic is bipartisan. You mentioned earlier that Jeremy Jones had reached across the aisle in New Hampshire, I think it was. What is the state of bipartisanship as it relates to climate change right now?
This is my least favorite question. It is really tough. We are trying so hard. Like, I feel like we're going to put up a billboard that's like, are you conservative? Do you like clean air and water? Join POW. And for us, this is massively simplifying the issue, but for us, we think clean air and clean water is not an argument. And unfortunately, the divisive nature of politics and our social fabric has put climate into this just war zone, to the point that when we have bipartisan conversations, we don't use the word climate because it can be a trigger word for a lot of communities. And so at POW, we are constantly seeking bipartisan work. We work closely with the Conservative Climate Caucus. We are always trying to endorse conservative candidates wherever we can. But the reality is there is a party that has more of a commitment to climate and environmentalism. And at some point, we are athletes. We have to win. Climate is not a race we can lose. And so as we seek bipartisanship, it's one of the reasons we have POW-AF, our action fund to endorse candidates. We want to send a message that this is important, and our movement is going to support candidates who are pro-environmental, either party. But until both parties show up, right now we have tended to be more on the Democratic side of the House.
What word do you use instead of climate when you're having those conversations? And just as a part two of that question, what is the best way? Obviously Thanksgiving is coming up, Christmas is coming up. We're going to be talking to our uncles a fair bit. How should we be talking about this to people that maybe don't want to hear about that?
Super important question. We don't want to speak to ourselves, right? Like we're always seeking communities that are kind of on the edge, that are centrist, that we can bring into this. Climate is not a top 10 issue. Climate philanthropy gets less than 1% of total charitable donations. And I don't get this. Climate is coming for us all. So this is probably one thing we should all be investing in. But so first, instead of the word climate, we've done a lot of messaging research on this. We use clean air, clean water. So if you hear Jeremy or me on a podcast with fewer friendlies, maybe than in this audience, you'll hear us really hammer, it's all about clean air, clean water. And that often creates more of an opening for a conversation. Speaking of dinner conversations, I found myself at an event a couple weeks ago, and I ended up getting seated next to an oil and gas executive. And my sister was on the other side of me, and she's like, can you just please keep a lid on it, at least until dessert, so we can just have this meal? And we ended up, sure enough, I think I said 2 words, and all of a sudden we were talking about what we do. And I said to this person, oh, I work at POW. And he goes, oh, I love POW. And I was totally taken aback. And I was like, do you know what we do? Do you know that we advocate to kind of end your industry? And he said, oh, but I love skiing. I mean, let me tell you about all the places I've skied in the world. And so we started comparing the skiing in Aspen and the skiing in Steamboat. And is it better than Utah? And have you been to Europe? And we had this whole conversation that was rooted in shared passion. And he brought up what I think are very good arguments in the importance of an energy transition, the importance of job security for people who work in this industry. And we had this amazing conversation that was rooted in shared passion. So that's why the theory of change at POW is to start with outdoor enthusiasm. If you go to someone and preach about how right you are, has that ever worked for you? No, that will never work. If we start from a place of common ground and the things that we love and want to see continue, that is a much better path for change, in our opinion.
Beautiful. It makes me want to ask, on the subject of we're athletes, we need to win. Who is the competition? Is it mostly lobbyists and organizations on the other side? Is it the oil and gas lobby going to DC that POW is trying to out-influence?
I would say it's the status quo. It's an even higher order. Consumer behavior change is so hard. We are so used to doing things the way that we do them. And renewables are going to win. That is already happening. The costs and the economics of renewable energy is better. And over time, we all know that's the way. The challenge is we don't have time. So there's an acceleration that needs to happen so that we avoid the worst impacts of climate. And think about what happened recently to the North Carolina community, beautiful trail community in Asheville. I mean, the impact of Hurricane Helene on that community. Asheville sits at 2,000 feet in the mountains and was previously considered a climate haven. And now the impacts of just that one storm are expected to be $160 billion. So we are all experiencing this now. And it's why I think we're going to have this moment where more and more people are coming to the table, not just skiers and snowboarders. We're probably the worst named organization because our interest now is from summer athletes more than anything. But it's really becoming about, okay, this is a problem. And the enemy is, how do we get past the status quo of we've always done something one way? And we need to turn this really slow moving ship called human society in a different direction more quickly.
How do you think about it? A lot of the stuff that you're working on, we're talking about lobbying in DC, we're talking about, kind of US athletes and stuff. Do you think at all beyond, I mean, the US is obviously one of the biggest groups out there, right? And the most going on, but do you think about anything on a global scale in terms of trying to get the message out beyond the borders?
Definitely. I mean, climate change is inherently borderless. So we have 14 global chapters. We have a unified EU. There's no Brexit and POW. They're all together. And in some cases, there are European laws that are so much more progressive than in the US. So we look to them as a model. And then when I think about our audience, I still think very much from like a marketer's consumer perspective. What does our customer, our outdoor state participant care about? I think about how people participate all over the world in races. So Dylan, you were just at UTMB. That's like an amazing place to activate on climate. We were at Leadville, which is in the US, but draws an international audience. It's one of the best races in the world. And we set up a panel of our athletes to talk about how we modernize the grid and like talk about an unexpected conversation at the finish line of Leadville. I'm sure there were some finishers who were like, let me have a protein shake and then we'll talk about this. But that's kind of our theory of change. Like that's where we show up. And I think as we move forward, one of my goals is to have this like United Nations of POW where we all come together, because last year there were horrible wildfires in Canada. It was actually the fourth largest emitter of carbon. This one wildfire was on par with what countries emit in a year. That's how bad these natural disasters are getting. But guess who suffered from it? It was people in the US, in New York City, where you saw that apocalyptic smoke, where, God forbid, like what it did to emergency services, but like runners could not go outside. And those are our people. That is the way of life that we care about. And so we have to bring this international point of view together.
So interesting. Coming back to you personally, you started in this role just back in January, so you're only about 10 months into the job. Personally curious as to what made this the right next step for you, because it feels to me, just looking at your work history, you could have gone any number of a million different directions. There must have been something special about the leadership role at POW that compelled you.
Yeah, well, I'll give your audience my advice. We'll call it solicited since you asked. It's usually unsolicited. But first, I saw the Power Crystal in the POW brand.
I love the Power Crystal branding. Lucy, I'm going to steal that, okay?
Yeah, we're stealing that. It's ours now. Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you, Erin, but I'm stealing it.
You need to ask your future participants in the podcast, do you come from a Power Crystal brand? Do you know what that means? And there are a lot of them in outdoor. That's the good news. So I saw that in POW, and I always look for the ones that are like poised to grow. When I was at Specialized, the women's business was that. It was this like massive opportunity that like nobody was moving on yet. And we were able to build women's cycling in this awesome way. And so at POW, I saw the Power Crystal. And then I felt a sense of urgency around it. The next 10 years in climate really matter. I think I will be in some form of outdoor forever, because I think getting outside is like the patient zero of like every social ill. If we all started the day with an hour outside, I think we'd solve a lot of problems. But climate in particular, the next 10 years and like whether we make progress to a significant degree or not is make or break. And those challenges are just so rare. And I remember when I was thinking about taking a role, I was talking to a career counselor and I was like, gosh, my ideal role is just like at the intersection of outdoor and climate, working with athletes and like making a difference on this huge problem. And she was like, that is a very specific thing that you want to do. And, you know, when you define it, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So that's partially how I think about it too, is like set an intention. Like the hardest thing is we often don't say what we really, really, truly want. And when you say it, like the universe conspires to set up the opportunity.
You manifested it, so to speak.
Totally.
The power crystal came and found you.
Yeah, this has been a little bit woo-woo, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, we always talk about kind of the practical X's and O's of the operations, whether it's Erin and I's respective businesses or those of our guests. And you said our shadow, what was it? Our shadow
shadow is longer than our tree.
Our shadow is longer than our tree. I'm personally curious, I'm sure our audience is too, what the organization looks like now, the number of people that you work with directly, and then more broadly when you expand it out into the alliances and stuff.
Yeah, we have 30 full-time staffers, and it's just amazing to me, like the output we have with so few people. It's taught me that a driven, high talent team is often a path to success. And some of that comes from this extensive network. So we have over 100 athletes on our various alliances. We have a climb alliance, snow, run, our fastest growing alliance, the most interest right now, cycling. And little hint, we may be getting excited about water and water sports and bringing in, we've had a lot of inbound requests from those athletes to be a part of POW.
Awesome.
And then beyond that, there's over 100 brands. So, when you add up all of that influence, when you take, okay, we have these athletes, these brands, we have these creatives who are like world-class photographers, videographers, and also up-and-comers who perhaps were a professional athlete and are now coming into our network and are learning the ropes from the mentors that we have that have been doing this for a long time. When you add all of that up, we have a reach of about 70 million. And that is starting to make a dent in that outdoor state number. So our next task, we've been kind of at the top of the mountain for a while, and we're going to start to build the base of the mountain. And we really want to meet any outdoor enthusiasts. If you're a hiker, if you like to walk your dog. One of my friends is like, I walk to the grocery store. I'm like, count it. Like, if you're not in a car and you're outside and you like it, we welcome you. So really widening the aperture and having an inclusive focus on, if you care about the future of clean air and clean water, this is for you, and become a part of Team POW.
So I want to continue on that, because there's a lot of people listening that operate brands, are part of brands, or just interested in this topic in general. Is there some tactical stuff that people can actually do? I mean, clearly we could donate to POW, but what are other things that we can do that will make a significant difference if we want to get behind what you're doing and want to really be a part of it in a bigger way?
The number one way is to join Team POW. So that is on our site. It's free for now. That might change, so get in there. And it's really to just welcome everyone to the foundation of the movement. And then through Team POW, we drive a lot of our education. We're sending out like, here's what you need to know about the Inflation Reduction Act. Here's a new piece of legislation moving through. Here's what it means. Here's a point of view on pro-climate voter engagement tactics. So things like that. We also do lunch and learns, and then we're looking to expand. We do a lot of in-person events in the communities we operate in, which tends to be the Mountain West, and then a little bit of California and the Pacific Northwest. But that's going to grow as we bring more people into it.
Is there one singular most important initiative right now that we could rally some support behind?
The most important thing, whether it's POW or beyond for climate right now in October 2024, is to vote. And not just to vote, but to triple your vote. So there's a lot of research that says that people often do something because of social pressure and because their friends are doing it. I mean, this might be Strava's entire business model. Strava, great partner of POW. We have a challenge going on right now. And what that does in voting, people often think like, of course, everyone's going to vote. That is actually not true if you look at the numbers on voter participation. So we're encouraging everyone to participate in our Stoke the Vote campaign by tripling your vote, texting, calling, asking 3 friends whether or not they plan to vote. There's no candidate endorsement in that. You don't have to pick a side. It's just recognizing that civic engagement is important and making sure your voice is heard is important, and make sure you have a plan to get to the polls.
So good. Erin, any closing questions for Erin? I have one, but feel free to jump in here.
I guess Dylan and I are both big bookworms, and we're always looking to learn and get engaged and involved in stuff. And I wonder if there's anything that stands out to you, anything that you've read or anything, literary that might be kind of interesting for, we've got kind of like a Second Nature book club going on our Slack channel. Anything that you'd recommend in terms of books on the topic, or just for us to continue learning even more?
Yeah, there are so many. So someone who's a friend of POW is named Bill McKibben. He is one of the greatest climate activists of all time. He's also a crazy passionate Nordic skier. And he wrote a book in 1989 called The End of Nature that predicted the exact situation we're in now. And on the one hand, it's sad because it's avoidable. And on the other hand, it's really empowering because it points to the power of individual citizens and what we can do to drive mass scale change. So you can read that, or you can follow his newsletter, which is one of my favorite sources for like slightly unhinged and super accurate climate information. And he's a very vocal activist. There's another book, if you trend more optimistic, called What If We Get It Right, which is by the absolute icon of climate at the moment, a marine biologist named Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. So I would definitely recommend that. And if you trend more athlete, climber, alpinist, I would recommend Graham Zimmerman's book, A Fine Line, which is a memoir about his time as a climber and his journey to climate advocacy. So that's a book if you're someone who is an outdoor participant and kind of wants to feel what it might be like to get more involved in this type of work.
My goodness, man.
Yes.
The book club is going to be gonna have a backlog here.
Book club's on fire right now.
I guess we got our BPC segment done there too. Erin, we always do a closing segment where we talk about brands, products, and content that we call BPC. So that's a bunch of different pieces of content that our audience can go.
You just delivered big time on BPC. That was awesome.
So I'm a huge nerd. So if anyone ever wants to like really get in there on the data and science of climate, we can go there. We can do a follow-up.
Well, that's kind of where I was going to go as we move towards closing here. It's clear I wouldn't use the word nerd for you. What I would say is that Erin, Lutzi, and I are outmatched intellectually in this conversation. You are clearly driven, talented. You've achieved a lot in your career. As I said, you've only been in this role for 10 months. It takes a little while to settle into things. So for you personally, like, what are your goals in this role during your tenure, however long it lasts?
My biggest goal is in a couple years, defining that loosely because this work takes time, I'm learning. I want everyone who's an outdoor enthusiast to be a part of POW, right? So if you look at that outdoor state, the 175 million, we've made a little scratch in it, but we haven't made a dent yet. And I believe we are in this moment of people are coming to the table in record numbers to want to work on climate, not just in a role like POW, people who are demanding change inside their companies, people who are volunteering in their community, people who are transitioning to jobs in climate tech, in nonprofits and sustainability. Like we're seeing that happen in record numbers. And I believe that the outdoor industry is the absolute vanguard of this. We have been dealing with this longer than most, and our businesses have more to lose from extreme weather events and just the unsettled environmental world that we're living in. And it's also a source of joy and love and pride for all of us who love the outdoors. So, my hope is that this all comes together and we build this movement and we make a difference. And that difference is going to come through policy change, through elected officials that like don't question this, like it becomes like the greatest bipartisan issue of our time. And I see a world where we solve this. So the greatest thing that gives me hope in climate is it's all solvable. We just have to stop burning things. But that's a oversimplification of the human challenge that we're facing. And so POW's role in political and cultural will, while sometimes underestimated, I think is one of the most important ingredients to achieving that success.
Well, Erin, what a joy it was to have you on the podcast. Great to get to know you. Congratulations on all the great work you're doing with POW, and we're excited to get involved.
Awesome. And we will see you both on our cycling and run alliances, I believe. So you will actually be getting a follow up from me. So welcome to Climate Advocacy.
I just joined Team POW while we were doing this discussion, so that's +1. It took me like 2 seconds. So I encourage everyone listening, if you haven't already, it's so simple. It's right on the website. 2 seconds to put in your info and you're good to go.
Awesome.
Thanks, Erin.